Aloha, and welcome to a conversation about the film Eating Up Easter. Thanks for joining us. My name is Kālewa Correa, and I serve as a curator on the Mother Tongue Film Festival and at the Asian Pacific American Center. This program is presented as a part of the 2021 Mother Tongue Film Festival, The Healing Power of Storytelling. The festival takes place entirely online this year and is conceived to highlight the work of language revitalization around the world and the crucial role that languages play in our daily lives. I am truly honored to be speaking with filmmaker Sergio M Rapu from the film Eating Easter, whom you'll meet in the next few moments. If you don't know about the Mother Tongue Film Festival, I encourage you to check out mothertongue.si.edu to learn more about our films, events, educational resources, and more. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome our guest, Sergio. Aloha and welcome, Sergio. I'm delighted to be joined by Rapa Nui filmmaker Sergio M Rapu. Sergio, so mahalo for joining me right now. And your film, Eating Up Easter, follows Piru, Mahani, Enrique, and your father as change makers in Rapa Nui. They all have their different approaches and methods. How did you decide to follow them as your features of your film?
Yeah, well, aloha to you folks, and thank you for having us on here and the film on this awesome festival. Finding the characters for the film actually took a while. Early on, we knew we wanted to make a film about the modern day issues on Rapa Nui, but it seemed so big. Like, how do you tell this huge, vast, and like very complicated story, especially for Native people, Indigenous people, like dealing through, Westernization and globalization. And so we tried to identify individuals that had different perspectives on the same issue. I think oftentimes the Indigenous voice is seen as just the one voice, right? Oh, the Native people must think this, the Indigenous people must think this. But as you know, as many of us Native people know, like, it's vast and diverse, right? And it's all based off of the generational issues that we all have dealt with and have learned from. So in identifying the different characters, we knew it was important to kind of try and find people on different points in the spectrum to give more of an honest reflection of what the Rapa Nui community was feeling during the time. So what all of these characters share is that they're all Native Rapa Nui. They were all born on the island, and they all left the island at some point to be educated, to have different experiences. Mama Pidu, for a very long time, she lived in France. My dad was educated in the U.S. in archaeology. Both Mahani and Enrique also left the island to learn their own to get their own training. But all of them returned, and I think it's sort of this step from outside of your community and then back in that you see your community differently. So really, that's kind of what all of our characters share, but they also contrast each other pretty strongly. Mama Pidu, for all her work with microplastics and really trash in general on the island, she was very opposed to modernization and globalization, wanting to return to a time of her childhood, wanting to return to a time of when there was very little contact with outside, when we didn't have as many planes and ships. My dad, on the other side, I would say, was probably on the other side of the spectrum. He understood not only the positive things of his childhood, but also maybe the difficult things about his childhood. Not having great education, not having good medical care, hospitals, things like that. And so his outlook was that you know what, modernization is coming. So we as Rapa Nui need to educate ourselves on it and be able to control it so that we're able to preserve elements of our culture, right? While we become part of the modern world. And Mahani and Enrique were kind of in this middle space because they were and are continue to be sort of evolving their organization, which started off as something very cultural. It's about arts and culture and music, but through that, they're teaching arts and culture and music from other parts of the world too, not just Rapa Nui. So in a way, Mahani and Enrique represent maybe the more holistic way of living today, that at times is very complicated, especially for young indigenous people.
Oh, mahalo for the answer. So, do you think Mahani and Enrique, they're approaching progress in a uniquely Rapa Nuian way at that point? Whereas it seems like it's hard to balance both paying homage to tradition and having progress at the same time because they're generally at odds with each other. So what does that sort of Rapa Nuian way forward look like to you, or do you think that was embodied with folks in your film?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's a very complex question. I think I can't necessarily speak for my entire community, but as for me personally, I do think that it is necessary for us as Native Rapa Nui, as Native people of the Pacific, to understand the world outside of our island and to be able to communicate and exchange with it. Because it's difficult to say that we won't be connected anymore with the rest of the world. COVID is its own experiment in that, at least for us in Rapa Nui. But I think something that was really impactful for me in the filming of the film was when my dad talked about cultural preservation and how that is at times misdefined by common people because they identify culture as being in one particular point in time, right? That the Rapa Nui were the true Rapa Nui were the ones that were building the moai hundreds of years ago, not the ones today. And I think that really undermines us today, us that wear modern clothes, that drive modern cars, that want to eat diverse foods or educate ourselves in other cultures and different languages, right? To me, I think culture is defined by a set of values, and those values are practices. So when it comes to the importance of community, right, the importance of environment, of protection of land, when it comes to the protection of language in order to understand the way to think about somebody else, whether it be your father or your cousin or even your enemy in that way, or perceived enemy. So for me, I think that there is a balance of being able to modernize and to adapt to the way that we as a global civilization are moving forward, while also maintaining these cultural values that our ancestors had and that we continue to have as a community.
Oh, thank you so much for that answer. That's solid. So Rapa Nui being the most isolated island in the world. I come from the most isolated archipelago in the world, from Hawaii, but you're coming from the most isolated island in the world. What do you think a sustainable economy looks like for Rapa Nui, given that it is such a small space, but yet at the same time, you have so many people that want to go there, and your film really looks at this idea of like, currently it's not very sustainable the way that it is, but what would a sustainable economy for Rapa Nui look like in your opinion?
Well, these are difficult questions, but I appreciate that we're talking about this because it is these questions about sustainability aren't only relevant to Rapa Nui, but they are to us as a planet, and even to sort of individual countries and communities as we think of ourselves with borders or inside of borders. I don't know if we as humanity have figured out what that means, what a sustainable economy means. Because in the US, on the mainland at least, when we start looking at things as sustainable, it's because we're able to put them into a lens of like where its impact is, you know. But you can always be zooming out on something and realize that there's continuous impact with other things that are happening. To kind of like put it more concretely, in Rapa Nui, because we're such a small community, Mahani says this in the film, you can see changes almost immediately, right? And you can see the impact of something new introduced almost immediately or within weeks. And this is why the garbage, you know, is so in sight, right? We can see it. We can see the effects of microplastics on Rapa Nui because we're so small. Now, if you take those same issues and you look at, say, where I'm living right now in Minneapolis, we're in the middle of this massive country with buildings and infrastructure and all of this stuff. And those problems are here at a much bigger scale, but we don't see them, right? They're hidden behind buildings. They're hidden within sort of bigger recycling centers that are not open to the public, all of these things. So I think for us to be thinking about sustainable economy, it's not just about economy. It's about sort of like the whole picture of us living. Like, how do we live as human beings? What do we require as human beings? And I think once we're able to kind of understand our individual impact on the world around us or the community around us, then we start getting a little closer to understanding what sustainability is, right? It's a bit picturesque, but thinking back to Rapa Nui when there were a lot fewer planes, or when there were no planes, when there were only ships, even though life was very difficult because there were very few resources, the community in itself was a lot more sustainable because they had to be very careful with those resources. There wasn't a lot, you know? And so I think returning to, again, the values of reusing, the values of community and sharing in this modern context is maybe a path towards sustainable economy. It's a sense of including a lot of these things that we're all talking about circular economy, about reducing waste, about the reducing and the reusing coming before recycling, when oftentimes recycling is the first thing that we do, you know? So yeah, it's a complex problem. I don't know the answer to it, you know, but I do know that our ancestors were able to achieve it, you know, in some form, maybe not completely, but in some form. And so I lean on the values that they had to try and understand how to get back to that today.
That's a beautiful answer. Thank you. I know it's a complex issue, and it's one of those things. Even here in Hawaii, we look at the main source, I guess, of our economy as tourism, and I guess that will lead me to my next question here: is tourism a sustainable economy? And with tourism, there's a certain level sometimes of entitlement that comes along with visitors. And does Rapa Nui see that sort of idea, or that sort of carried with them from the visitors that they get? Is there a certain expectation by the visitors when they're coming in? And you kind of show through your film like how it's changed over time, and how many visitors you guys are getting now every year to the island, and how that's impacting things. And so if you want to say a little bit about tourism and maybe the effects or the way that tourism is affecting Rapa Nui, for both positive and negative. I'd like to get your sort of thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, similar to Hawaii, we have, I mean, not in the scale, of course, but tourism plays such a big role, like economically, in Rapa Nui. It is, prior to COVID, it was the number one source of income, really the only income other than a government job or something like that in Rapa Nui. Comparatively to Hawaii, there are other sort of industries there, obviously not as big as tourism. But in Rapa Nui, like we don't export anything. We don't produce anything. And so much is dependent, right, on these airplanes coming in and these ships and things. And yeah, I would say, kind of to your point of entitlement, I think the easier it is to get to a place, the more entitled oftentimes people feel when they get there. Meaning that I think it's difficult for people to turn that switch in their mind when they get to a foreign place or to a place that's very far away, that says, oh, I'm now in a completely different part of the world. Like, this is a completely, not only different culture, but what they have access to here is different. What is available here is different. That switch of understanding what you have at home and what you don't have in another place, I think doesn't happen when it's easier to get to a place, right? Because then you assume that all of your comfort of home should also be able to get to that place. And so I, as a visitor, should be able to like buy the things that I buy at home, should have my comforts at the prices that I pay at home, and that's just not possible. Neither in Hawaii or the rest of the Pacific or in Rapa Nui. As you know, it's incredibly expensive to get anything on an island. And so we would often see a lot of culture clash, I guess I would call it, between visitors, tourists that come expecting the comforts of home, and then they don't get it, or they get it, but at 20 times the cost, right? And so this was kind of like a little bit of a catalyst for us making the film. We started realizing that not only people were not really kind of understanding where they were coming to, but they also had this completely different idea about Rapa Nui. They saw documentaries and books and things that talked about a past, that talked about the Moai, that talked about sort of this like theoretical collapse, right? And so then they're coming to the island assuming, oh, it's this like deserted, like mysterious, like picturesque place. And they land and they realize, oh yeah, well, I got to stay at a hotel. Oh, I want to rent a car to get to these places. Oh, like, can I drink the water? I may get sick. So where's the bottled water? I remember even, so we worked for a while in tourism, but I remember for a really, really long time when we started getting the first vegetarian tourists on the island, and we were all panicked, like, what do we serve these people? Like, we have no idea. Like, we don't, at that time, we're a lot better now, but at the time, like, people barely like grew lettuce or tomatoes for themselves. And then all of a sudden we're like, shoot, we got to go buy like some lettuce and tomatoes that was just shipped in from the mainland to feed this person. Is that going to be enough? Are they going to be starving? So I think there's like learning from both sides of it. And yeah, not to kind of like continue the same thing, but I think as it becomes easier to get to a place, as there are more airplanes, right, that land on Rapa Nui, then the expectation of the tourist is different. When it was so difficult to get there, when there was one ship a year or one airplane every couple of weeks, not only did people spend a longer time on Rapa Nui, and so then that switch sort of like, got flipped eventually, but they were also more grateful about being able to make that travel, so it wasn't just about sort of taking pictures and sort of luxury travel and then jumping on the plane and leaving again. It was more about an emotional connection to the place that you are. And I think that's really what we, and I've heard of a lot of Rapa Nui that want to kind of get back to, like, if once tourism returns, because we assume it will return at some point, we want to try and attract more mindful tourists, people that want to have a connection with the community that they're visiting, that care about the place that they're visiting. And it's not sort of this sort of selfish sort of individualistic experience, but it's actually sort of a cross-cultural experience. But it, kind of, as you mentioned, like, there are positive sides to tourism too. Tourism brings that income that we now all, as sort of this modern world, have require, right? I even give the example of, like, it is because of tourism and sort of the business that my family ran that we were able to move to the US, that I was able to get an American education there, and I was able to make this film, right? So I can't say that I have not benefited from tourism. I've completely benefited from tourism. And I think it's through that benefit that now I'm able to help my community again, So I think we just have to be careful and careful about the industry. Yeah.
No, mahalo for that answer. That was fantastic.
On some of
yeah. Yeah.
I'll be short it up if you want.
Nah. Awesome. So my next question for you is, I think I knew this, but maybe I didn't. But you mentioned it in the film that Rapa Nui has provisions in place to limit land ownership to the descendants of the Rapa Nuian people, and not Chilean nationals, which you folks are a part of Chile. And how does that play out on the island, or what would that look like if it was opened up a little bit more, or if it was opened up to Chilean ownership of the island? And because here in Hawaii, we don't have any of those provisions in place where land is set aside or land is protected in a way for Native Hawaiians here. So for us to look at Rapa Nui as an example of where indigenous lands still lay in the hands of the Native people, I see that as something that is, in my opinion, a positive. But from your standpoint, how do you see that?
Yeah. I laugh because I think about this story my dad told me a while ago, where he was working in archaeology in like Wyoming or something like that as like an undergraduate student, and this guy, just kind of from there confuses him as a Navajo, right? Because he had long hair, he was dark skinned, and of course, okay, so you must be sort of native to this area. Are you Navajo? And my dad sort of like teases him back a little bit, and he's like, no, my reservation is like way over there. Like, you get to this big body of water called the Pacific Ocean, and then you just kind of keep going down there, and then like that's where my reservation is. And I haven't until recently sort of thought about Rapa Nui as kind of this idea of like a reservation in the middle of the ocean, and also especially today, there's so many like negative connotations to space, like a reservation, right? Especially for Native people of the mainland in the U.S. But there, we are unique in that way. Rapa Nui has this law. It's a Chilean law that only allows for native Rapa Nui to be able to own the land. And it was put in place at a time. My dad calls it kind of very paternalistic law, where those in government sort of assumed that the Rapa Nui were kind of not educated enough to understand the value of their land, and so they may sell it off, right? But throughout the years, it has become actually very important and very valuable for us to be able to still retain that ownership. Like everything in Rapa Nui, it's also complex, because oftentimes the ownership of land is also tied to wealth or value only if somebody else can buy it, right? So in the case of Hawaii, you can own a piece of property and then put it up as collateral to a bank in order to build a business or to build a house on that property, right? And if you don't pay back, then the bank can own it. But in Rapa Nui, that's not the case, because a foreign bank cannot own land on Rapa Nui, right? And so we even though we may own a lot of land, we can't generate capital off of it as sort of for a loan or something like that. But on the other side of it, because land is also so tied to cultural identity, to stories of family, to that history of Rapa Nui, that law also helps to preserve a lot of that, and to be able to, for us to still kind of use the land in ways that maybe our ancestors did in the past, right? So it's a complicated issue, and I'm thankful. I think I'm really thankful that the land is protected as it is, because it forces us to be a little bit slower and more mindful about development. If you can't just get sort of a lot of money up front to build this massive hotel or to build this sort of thing, if it takes a lot of work, then you're a bit more careful about the purpose behind that work. So I think ultimately that's kind of what it allows for us. Yeah.
Oh, but mahalo. Yeah.
But the land issue, I mean, even in Hawaii, I don't know it, as much as you, obviously, but like, I'm just reading these, and I don't want to sidetrack this either, but I just keep reading sort of like the cost of living in Hawaii and sort of home prices skyrocketing and kind of all of this stuff, and I wonder, like, does that happen? Would that happen, if there were some laws like this set into place? So at least the native people of the Aina of that land can still live on that land, right?
Yeah, no, I think the benefit that I see through your film and learning that is that the native population never really gets priced out, which I think is it's beneficial to retain that, to retain the people in order to have that Aina and have that culture still connected to that land, and so learning that through your film, I did not know that, having visited Rapa Nui and getting to experience it as such a wonderful place. I am actually, as a native person myself, native Hawaiian, I am stoked that you guys have that in place, even though I think what I saw was that you can't really commodify the land at that point, like you're saying. And so it does change the dynamic there. And I see it as a positive. I wasn't sure whether the Rapa Nui, and I know you don't speak on behalf of everyone, and you're speaking on behalf of yourself, but yeah, that's a really really wonderful law put in place, I think.
And I think it comes back to perspective, right? If if the physical land is the most important thing to you, then yes, like I think Rapa Nui, we have hit something incredibly important that we really need to hold on to. If Western hat on, wealth, sort of like big business, sort of having enough to sort of fund your children and grandchildren and all of that is important, which have elements to, right, this idea of community for us too as Pacific people. Then maybe this other side of like being able to use your land to make money is more important. So it's all a balance. It's all a balance, and I personally am really thankful for that. But I am just worried about, those Rapa Nui that have land but really aren't able to sort of generate the income that they need, right? Because of it.
So I guess leading to the next question that I have. So if we're looking at land as sort of like an ancestor and as our foundation of culture, in your film, there's a scene that there's someone holding a sign and it says museums give back stolen artifacts. And so when people think of artifacts, I think especially with many, Pacific Island cultures, when you see it in a museum, you're like, oh, that's that thing that happened a long time ago. And we're looking at something that is no longer representative of what modern day Pacific Islanders are experiencing, or it's something of the past. And so I think what I'd like to, I guess, ask you to elaborate on is can you speak a little bit more about how cultural heritage objects around the world, like what do those things mean to the Rapa Nui people, and what should the role of museums around the world, what should they play in fostering relationships with the Rapa Nui people having these cultural heritage artifacts?
Wow. Yeah, that's a heavy question. When you ask that, I think about a relative of mine that recently passed away, who was this amazing carver on Rapa Nui. He's married to my cousin, and they had some kids. And I was doing some filming with him, and he asked me, he's like, hey, could you do me a favor? Like, there's this book in the US, it's this really thick novel by Thor Heyerdahl, who was kind of one of the, early sort of Western explorers, and sort of studied a lot of Rapa Nui. But there's this really thick documentation of early Rapa Nui art. And it has a lot of pictures of, these artifacts that are all around the world. Can you get me a copy of this book? Because I want to be able to carve these things. I want to be able to carve, these statues, these figures made out of wood that we used to as a culture in the past. And it kind of hit me like really hard when he asked for that, because here is somebody who embodies sort of, if you think of all the character traits of a Rapa Nui, a carver nonetheless, right? And he is asking for a reproduction, right? Photos in this book that was made 50, 70 years ago as a resource to be able to understand the cultural practice that he is, right? That he comes from, that he is born from. Not even to go to a museum, because it's like way too expensive to travel to all these places and even just look, and asking for permission to take the thing out of the glass case to just look at how like the lines were carved on something, it really blew me away, and it made me really sort of upset and sad that we as a Rapa Nui community can't still have access to a lot of those artifacts. Not necessarily because the museums won't, let us go see them, but because they're so far away. You take the case of Hoa Hakananaia, which oftentimes has been in the news about this very unique moai that was taken from the island a long time ago and now sits in the British Museum. And there are thousands, if not millions, of Westerners that have walked through that museum, that have gotten to see it, the front and the back, and sort of all around it, and have seen it multiple times. But I would say very few Rapa Nui have actually been able to see it, right? This is something incredibly unique to the history of our island, that we only have access to via like photos on the internet or something like that, right? There's the other piece, I think, that's also very sort of emotional to me, is the rongorongo boards, right? So we as Rapa Nui are the only Pacific community that had a writing language, that had a written script. And these scripts were written on tablets. They're called rongorongo boards. And during sort of the time of Western contact, and then also eventually like the missionaries and things, a lot of them were burnt or destroyed. But a handful still remain. But none of them are on Rapa Nui. All of them are in museums around the world, right? And so there are people that try to replicate these on the island by carving them, by looking at pictures and things. But to be able to touch something that your ancestors touched, right? To like move your fingers over the carvings that they did, has another sort of cultural importance to you as a native person today. And so I really hope that as sort of museum systems evolve past, kind of what they used to be, that they really try and find ways of sharing, right, those artifacts back to communities. It doesn't necessarily mean giving them back, because oftentimes communities are not equipped to preserve them, right, into the future because of technological hurdles or economic hurdles, right? Maybe we don't have the right preservation techniques and things or education to do it. But it doesn't mean that we can't have that in the future. But really what we need now is a continued access to those artifacts that inform us about our past, and I think museums are slowly starting to do that. But wouldn't it be wonderful if the British Museum, once a year funded a trip for 10 new Rapa Nui to come and see Hoa Hakananaia, right? Like paid ticket, you go, you visit with your ancestor, right? And you're able to have this cultural exchange with the British Museum and that community there, and then you return. Like, I think that would be a fantastic way about giving back without museums necessarily having to return those artifacts.
That's a fantastic answer, and perhaps that's a part of a larger question of maybe that's what a part of a sustainable economy looks like too. Co-ownership, not really ownership, but the British Museum is now fostering more education, but they're also giving back to the islands in some way that actually is beneficial, that isn't impacting. So yeah, maybe there's something there that we can explore further as we go on. That I do have one last question for you, and it's I know you said it through your film, but I wanna do it through a question to you, which is, if you wanted to have the world know one thing about Rapa Nui and take away not only from your film, but you as a native Rapa Nuian, what would that be?
I think for me, Rapa Nui means continuous adaptation to change. Ever since, you even go back, way back to our history. pre-Western contact, you see evidence of people rethinking their use of their environment, of the way that they carve, of the way that they plant. Once we have contact with the West, it's a continuous sort of assessment of, oh, there's this new change. How do we adapt that change in order to survive, right? How do we adapt to be able to move forward, right? That sense of amua, like you can do it, like we can move forward. This is difficult, but we can thrive and survive beyond it. I think that to me embodies my culture, and that to me embodies not only Rapa Nui, I think, but I think a mindset that Native people in some capacity still maintain, and that I hope that we can all sort of like return to that, understand that there are difficult things that we need to do in our lives, in our planet, when we're facing all of these massive changes, right? Massive ways of rethinking about racial injustice and global warming and all of this stuff. But we can do it. Like we've done it for hundreds of years, right? It's not difficult to say that we can't like move beyond it. It's just a matter of moving beyond it and moving past sort of this, getting outside of this comfort bubble, right? And doing things that are uncertain and you're unsure of in order to be able to move forward as a community and society. That to me, I think really embodies my community and especially the characters, and especially, Mama Pidu, who we document in this film.
Yeah, speaking of her, I guess not to have a spoiler here, but she passed, and she was in your film. She's such a strong person, and to see that at the end, I was just stunned that it seemed like Rapa Nui lost this powerhouse, and that really touched me, because she was my favorite character, because she reminds me some of the aunties that we have here in Hawaii and some of my own family, where they're the ones driving. It's the women that are really driving the preservation of culture and the forwarding of culture. And to see that she passes and you dedicate it at the end to her, I was blown away by how much of a cultural resource and such a strong voice is lost there. And I just wanted to say that, and she's just amazing through the work and how you document her. She's just amazing, and I want to give my aloha to her family here too, through that. And I want to thank you for your time, and I want to give aloha nui to you, to your family there, and your time in Minnesota. And I really appreciate the time you've taken to speak with me and do a Q&A with the Mother Tongue Film Festival. And and I look forward to talking to you in the future and seeing more wonderful things coming out, and just having these conversations with you. I really appreciate it.
Right on. Kālewa, thank you so much. Maururu to you and to the Mother Tongue Film Festival. We're truly honored, to be part of it, and to continue to push forward our stories, because it's important to have this platform. So thank you very much.
Right on. Well, aloha.
A big mahalo and thank you to Sergio for sharing his experiences and vision of Rapa Nui. Also, a big thank you to all of you who tuned into our Q&A session. Follow the Mother Tongue Film Festival here on Facebook to get notifications about future events, And find us also on Instagram, YouTube, or visit our website at mothertongue.si.edu. And come back here for our next program. Aloha.